Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Roni Chowdhury. I'm an advisor for digital accessibility at CVS Health Digital, and we will talk about incorporating accessibility into SDLC workflows in this presentation. With that, let's move into today's agenda. So on a high level, what is it that we're trying to achieve through this presentation is we will discuss about the level of engagement that should happen during design cycle and development cycle stories, along with production validation. So I've separated this whole presentation into three sections. In the first one, we'll talk about accessibility engagement during design cycle. Second one, we'll talk about accessibility engagement during development cycle. And in the third one, we'll talk about accessibility engagement that should happen during production validation. Excuse me. Moving to the next slide, I have basically given a diagram outlining the stories that plays out typically during design cycle, starting with business discussion, to design phase stories that include user flow, wireframe, visual design, and copy deck. Next slide, I have added another diagram that basically includes the development cycle stories, starting with accessibility acceptance criteria provided for the development team from accessibility engineering to accessibility sanity check, and ending with accessibility user acceptance test. Once this stories for development phase is done, that's when the content moves to production, and then accessibility engineering plays a role on that as well by doing accessibility production validation. So the first topic we'll talk about today is the roles and responsibility and the engagement and that should happen from accessibility engineering during business discussion. What typically happens during business discussion? Business will come up with a set of requirements and they will look for a solution from the product team. Now, why accessibility should be a part of the discussion? I'll use an example. If the business is trying to put out a multimedia content, we understand that in order to make that multimedia content accessible, we should have certain, we should meet certain criteria. For example, closed captioning, audio descriptions, the media player has to be accessible. Now, closed captioning is a technology that has to be acquired if the company or the product team already doesn't have it. So that's a discussion that needs to happen because this will determine the scope and the budgeting of the project. So I've outlined a couple of other instances which makes engagement from accessibility important during business discussion, including defining the project scope in terms of accessibility. Who's going to be the target customer? Is it an internal application or an external application? Identifying requirements based on scopes and goals. Conduct research and assess resource, including tools required to validate content for accessibility. And also what accessibility can do during this cycle is they can call out initial solution by business that would not be accessible. So this should be the first level of engagement that accessibility plays during a product development cycle. Moving to design phase stories, typically design phase stories includes a user flow, a wireframe, a visual design, and a copy deck. Now, accessibility has a part to play in all four of these stories. First one, let's talk about the first one, where user flow. What is it that accessibility can do during a user flow? First thing they can do is they can make sure by evaluating the content that the content is as inclusive as possible, because we are considering physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities. Now, to do this, if user testing can play a really big role. So if companies already have their own opinion lab, it's highly encouraged that they should include people with cognitive disabilities and physical disabilities and have those user flows evaluated by them and take their feedback into consideration while developing a user flow. What are the tools that can be used? This would be the typical tools that's being used for developing the user flow. In example, InVision, ProveHub, even PDFs. So accessibility engineering will review the user flow, will take notes from user testing coming up from opinion lab and review and provide feedback. Of course, it's better if the company has a policy where an accessibility approval is required for each of these stories to ensure that accessibility has been reached, and before moving from one step to another, no phase has been skipped, the accessibility review process. Moving to the next slide, we have accessibility review for wireframe. So wireframe. how accessibility can play a role. I'll use again another example. If we are considering a huge form with 20 form fields, now for a regular able user, that might not look as complicated. But if you are considering someone with mobility disability who's only using a keyboard or a joystick of some kind, even braille, and trying to fill up that form field with 20 forms or 20 input form fields, that might be a struggle. Not just that, when it comes to error handling, that can also be really, really complicated. So we have to make sure that wireframes, as accessibility individuals, we have to make sure that wireframes are simple and intuitive, extremely intuitive to use. And we also have to make sure that the content they're putting out is perceptible. Now, what can we do for that huge form field with 20, with 20 form fields? We can break it down in 2 and 3 separate sections, depending on the content, of course. What that will do is it will be simplified. We can basically create 3 or 4, again, depending on the content, phase for that form fields where user will only fill out 3 or 4 separate information in one page before moving to the next one. And that way, error handling will be simpler. It will be easier for someone who is using a keyboard only or any kind of assistive technology that requires more time to fill out a form. Also, they don't have to do this scrolling up and down for this whole screen, which for someone with cognitive disability might be a struggle. So we have to consider all of those into our overall judgment or overall feedback that we'll be providing for the wireframe. User testing, again, can play a big role through the opinion lab for any company if they have it, or having someone having someone as a member of the team, accessibility engineering team, can also be really, really helpful here. Now, the tools that we can use to evaluate this is, again, the basic tools that are being used to develop a wireframe, which is, for example, InVision, ProofHub, PDF, etc. And if we can add an accessibility approval as a requirement for this stage, this will definitely be helpful to make sure that accessibility is being reached for the wireframe as well. Moving to the next slide, we'll talk about visual design. Now, visual design. User testing can be really, really helpful when it comes to visual design. For example, whether the content the designer have put out is acceptable and usable for someone with low vision or color blindness, not relying too much on color. The color scheme meets the accessibility acceptance criteria. The overall design is simple. The decorative contents are not too much complicated. So for having a design library for approved content can be really helpful when it comes to, evaluating visual design, because what that does is, if you have a set of design that's already being approved for accessibility, you can keep that consistency across multiple applications within the organization. Now, of course, design consideration based on disability type can be a part of overall accessibility evaluation, which will really be helpful. And we have to make sure the color contrast is okay. We have to make sure the color schemes are as expected. We can use certain tools to make sure that that's being achieved. For example, color contrast analyzer is a tool that's a freeware that we can use to make sure color contrast is working. When it comes to sharing those designs for evaluation, the same tools that's being used to develop that design, InVision, PDF can be useful here as well. And after providing the feedback, again, having an accessibility approval or making it a requirement is always helpful. Moving to copy deck. Now, when it comes to copy, again, the language being simple, extremely simple is required here. It's, for example, instead of using pharmacy, if someone uses RX, it makes it the same thing, but it's just pharmacy is simplified, and we were considering a huge group of people. We do not know whether the user has certain language barrier, the user has certain cognitive barriers. So we have to consider all of that. Again, analyzing feedback from user testing through opinion lab or through a team member who has certain disabilities is really helpful here. Whether this language, we understand we have certain uh, frames that copywriters try to work when it comes to putting out content. We have to make sure legal approves this content as well. So from my experience, legal more than often doesn't oppose to putting out simple contents, because if anything, plain language makes it easier for the user to understand. Also, it's just inclusive overall. What kind of tools that we can use to make sure the copy deck, it's basically the same tools that we use to share our copy deck with multiple stakeholders, example InVision, Excel, etc. And also having a content copy library for certain approved accessibility approved pattern can really be helpful. So if for bigger organization, having their own library means when putting out similar kind of product to market, they can always refer back to that library and come up with a similar type of language which is already being approved for accessibility. Accessibility approval, again, if we can have that as a requirement, this will just make sure that the copy deck, the language that's been put out for this product has met the requirement from accessibility perspective. Now, with that, let's move into the development phase stories, which basically includes three stories. First one is accessibility acceptance criteria provided for the development team from accessibility engineering. The second one is accessibility sanity check. And the third one was accessibility user acceptances. Accessibility, let's talk about accessibility acceptance criteria. So providing accessibility acceptance criteria for development team, we have to consider while we're doing that the development team might not have the same level of skill set when it comes to handling accessibility or making sure the content or the product has the same level of accessibility. Thus, we encourage always putting out accessibility acceptance criteria based on the content, where basically an engineer will go over the approved design content and lay out the expectation for the development team in terms of behavior for individual content. The criteria that an accessibility engineer should put out for developers should be testable. For example, if we are considering a button, right, and if we are considering a criteria like name, rule, and value, it is a testable criteria. That's something that a developer can make sure while they're developing it. So the acceptance criteria should be defined in a way that the developers can actually test those content while they're building it, just to make sure the back and forth is minimum. And they also have an understanding that their content needs to meet a certain level, not just from UI perspective, but also from accessibility perspective. This is also something we can introduce during the accessibility acceptance criteria. While providing accessibility acceptance criteria, is we can take steps to initiate accessibility automation. There are certain products out there in the market, for example, X, Wave, Andy, which is basically accessibility automation tools, which will evaluate the code base of the content and will throw out the potential accessibility violations and also possible solutions. So that can be something which we should introduce during the accessibility acceptance criteria for the developers. So while they're developing their product, they can run the X report and they can see what are the accessibility violations or potential violations that has happened on that content, and they can just fix it from that point on. And of course, in order to make sure that developers understand the depth of accessibility acceptance criteria, proper training for the developers is also a really important, plays a really important part. So as an organization, we have to make sure that the proper training process is happening for developers as well. And again, having an acceptance criteria library based on content can be really helpful when putting out similar kind of product. So the developers can always refer back to the library when it comes to evaluating or self-evaluating the content they're developing. Moving to accessibility sanity check, which is the next slide. So for large applications, if we're considering a huge application which includes 8, 10 screens, having a sanity check can be really helpful. Why? Because that gives us an understanding of the current accessibility standing for a product. Now, during development, even though once the product reaches a certain level of stability, an accessibility engineer should jump in and ask the question to the product owner that, hey, can we go on and do a sanity check on the product just to see where it stands in terms of accessibility? They can review those half-developed products and provide feedback to the QA environment just to make sure that the acceptance criteria that was provided, whether that's being met or not. Now, user testing can play a vital role here. Now, again, for bigger organization, if they have their own opinion lab, which includes user who use assistive technology to operate products, web-based, natives, whatever the product is, or even documentations, that can be really helpful. And as I've mentioned before, having an assistive technology user in the accessibility engineering team can come really, really handy, because they will give you the actual feedback. We as able as accessibility engineers, we're trying to put ourselves in their position while trying to evaluate certain content based on our knowledge and experience, but they are the real user. So their feedback is extremely, extremely vital. So having a sanity check, which includes their feedback, and feedback getting from, coming from opinion lab, can play a really big role here. Inclusion of assistive technology user, as I've mentioned already, it's in your own team is really, really important. What kind of tool we can use to evaluate the contents for sanity checks? Again, for automation, you can use X, Wave, Andy. What kind of pairing we can apply to evaluate the content? We can try Chrome with NVDA. We can try Firefox with JAWS. We can try Safari with VoiceOver. Now, it depends, or this pairing depends on the type of content you are trying to put out. If it's an internal product you are trying to put out, a company has certain control over what type of tool they will be providing to the user who basically belongs to their organization. So they can have certain controls that this product should be used with, for example, Chrome and NVDA, and they'll be providing, of course, NVDA to their users to evaluate it. Or even use it, sorry. Now, when it comes to B2C, business to customer, we do not have any control what the customer will end up using in terms of assistive technology. So we have to make sure it's as broad as possible. Also, one more thing we can make sure during the sanity check is whether the accessibility automation, which should have been outlined already during the accessibility acceptance criteria, whether that's being performed by the developers or not. Because we have to make sure the accessibility is always in the mind of developers while they are developing the product. All right, with that, we will move to our next slide, which is basically accessibility user acceptance test. Now, user acceptance test is something that we basically will do once a feature is completely developed. So basically, what we'll do is we'll take that product, we will compare that against the acceptance criteria that was provided, when we'll try to make sure that the product meets the provided accessibility acceptance criteria. Now, again, user testing plays a huge role during this phase, because for all the reasons I've already mentioned. User feedback, who uses assistive technology on a daily basis, is your end client. So they can give you insights in terms of accessibility for your product like nobody else can. So that is really, really important. And we as accessibility engineering individuals should be the person to make sure that the product goes through opinion lab if an organization have it, and we collect those feedbacks while providing our own feedback to the teams while evaluating the product. Okay, What kind of tools we should be using? Again, pretty much the same tools that we'll be using for our sanity checks. Example, automation, we can use X, we can use Andy, we can use Wave, assistive technology pairing, we can use Chrome NVDA, Firefox with JAWS, and Safari with VoiceOver. At this point, after evaluating the content, if we see that the developed product does not meet the accessibility acceptance criteria requirements, then we should raise violations, if there is any, of course. Now, ideally, it's always what we preach is making sure a product does not go to production if it has any critical or high level accessibility violations. Why? One, then your user will not be able to use it. User with assistive technology will not be able to use it. Two, it basically poses legal risk as well. So for both of these reasons, trying to make sure and trying to evaluate your developed product before it goes to production is really, really important. And raising those high and critical violations and also making sure that that's being taken care of before the product goes to production, again, it's extremely important. Once that is done, the accessibility engineers will follow up on those defects. We'll try to make sure that that's being fixed through revalidation. Once that is over, we encourage to have an accessibility sign-off policy in place for all the products that's being developed, just to make sure that the accessibility has been performed and it's been accepted. The product has been accepted by an accessibility engineers or accessibility SME to make sure that the complete evaluation for accessibility is done for the product to go to production. Now, let's move to the next slide, and where we'll talk about the production validation and what can we do as an accessibility engineer for production validation stage. So basically, it's pretty much the same in terms of operation. It's pretty much the same for UAT. We just have to make sure that the user acceptance test that we have performed for the developed feature, it has not changed for the product that's out there in production. So execute production validation based on testable acceptance criteria. Similar accessibility evaluation process as accessibility user acceptance test, and provide feedback and raise violations if there is any, if a violation that was not present during the final UAT evaluation, and it due to some code changes that a new violation has been identified, that's something that needs to be raised and fixed immediately. Also, for something that's already in production, if a code change happens or a new feature has been introduced for that content which is already in production, the accessibility engineer should definitely go on and have a production validation for those code changes as well, just to make sure that the product out there facing customers is completely accessible. That basically, with that, we have reached the end of this presentation. I just wanted to end this presentation with a good note. I know 2020 has been a tough year for most of us, so it's just a good information that to share that happened in 2020. So I have a slide with title that says rhino poaching in South Africa has decreased by almost 53% in first 6 months of 2020. And I have a picture of a baby rhino. Looks like he's smiling. I'm sorry, he or she is smiling. That is an achievement for 2020, which, to be honest, there's not a lot of achievement that we are good news to share for 2020. So this is definitely something worth sharing. And let's hope that we won't need another pandemic to keep up the good work. And with that, I will include my presentation. Thank you so much once again, and all the best to everyone.